Hi, everybody. So, this week we are going to be talking about early Japanese theater history. Um, the really cool thing about the development of Asian theater is that it developed and changed at a pace that was really quite different than that of the West. And what was really neat is that it remained completely distinct from Western theater until well into the 20th century. So you won't see any influences on Japanese theater from the Greeks or the Romans. They just remained completely distinct. They were their own complete thing, no influences at all. So let's dive in. We can assume that at the time of the ancient Greeks and the ancient Romans, way, way back in those BCE days that we've been talking about, we can assume that that Asian ancient Asian theater was also happening, that these cultures had also had indigenous traditions of storytelling, along with narrative dance and narrative song and other forms of performance. But we don't know anything definite about them. There's no single date in history that's agreed upon that establishes, like, this is the start of Asian theater. This is when Asian theater started. There's no date that all the theater historians agree upon for that. And this is because it really depends on what theater historians classify as theater, what counts as theater. So it ends up being this wide range in Asian theater histories because Asian theater wasn't like Western theater. And so it was harder for scholars to define with or without a bias. As you'll see as we look into Japanese theater, especially, Asian theater wasn't maybe fitting into what Western theater historians were defining as theater. Oh, this is what theater looks like. What the Greeks were doing was what theater is. And the Asians were doing something completely different. So a lot of theater historians weren't acknowledging it and weren't counting it as part of something that they could put a finger on and say, well, this is when theater started in Asian cultures, because they weren't necessarily allowing it to be considered theater, which is kind of crazy because theater can be a broader definition, I think, anyway. So anyway, we're going to dive into Japanese theater history this week, and the early history of Japan and its theatrical forms are, as I've sort of been saying here, it's sort of shrouded in mystery. Because there wasn't a written historical account of Japanese theater history until 712 CE. So we're already in Common Era when we get a written history of Japan. So we don't have any of those ancient things like we've talked about with Greece and Rome, because they had all those written historical accounts from way before. But before then, before this 712 CE, when we start getting written historical accounts in Japan, before then there were numerous rituals, many related to Shintoism, which is an old Japanese religion which began in nature and ancestor worship. And it is believed that these rituals of Shintoism were probably the first kind of theatrical elements in Japanese theater history. So here we are again with religion kind of being at the start of theater, just like the Greeks and the Romans. You know, those religious festivals was where the plays were taking place, right? But it makes sense because if religion, especially way back then, if religion was a way of making sense of life and making sense of different phenomena, then isn't that what storytelling is? Isn't storytelling also a way of making sense of things? So I think they kind of go hand in hand. So to me, it makes sense that historically, religion and storytelling and theater and that kind of ritual all go hand in hand. All right, so we're diving in to Japanese theater history, and I'll see you on the next slide.